I recently watched the new trailer for Final Fantasy XVI, and sure, it looks pretty slick. The characters, world, and battle sequences all look like the sort of thing that I want to see from the Final Fantasy series. But does that mean we should all be holding back tears of joy and amazement as seen in so many reaction videos to this trailer? And the answer is no. First of all, what trailer doesn't look great these days? Final Fantasy trailers have always looked really good. The series has rarely ever had a problem with great visuals, although there are exceptions. And yet, the last 3 Final Fantasy games that I played have all been mostly disappointing and forgettable. And this isn't just my opinion, although sure, every major installment to the Final Fantasy series has generally sold well, but that's largely because most Final Fantasy fans, granted, myself included, rush to buy the next game despite being repeatedly disappointed by the last. And so, good sales doesn't mean the games were particularly good. In fact, if you take a quick look at the ratings, you can see that the Final Fantasy series has been on a steady decline for nearly 20 years since Final Fantasy X. And sure, we can see an upturn there with Final Fantasy VII Remake, but I would argue that that's not to do with the game being very good and more to do with the fact that it's the remake of arguably the most popular game in the series. I mean, really, when you consider how iconic that game is, how much nostalgia it has attached to it, and how influential it was, really, if it was done right, it should have been more around a 95-97% mark. At the very least, you would expect it to be over 90. In summary, for a while now, the Final Fantasy series has been sort of
good, not great. Now,
and it doesn't appear to be a technical limitation with what they can do anymore. They appear to be more than capable of building amazing open worlds that look awe-inspiring and beautiful. They've also come a long way with regards to refining the battle system in their games. Whilst I still think it needs improvement, especially with regards to strategy, I felt that the battle system in 7R was good, if only as the foundation for further needed improvements. The main problem now appears to be creative direction. They appear to be obsessed with convoluted stories that are poorly explained, or not explained at all, in tandem with making gameplay choices that are just plain bizarre and terrible. For example, FF13 was intensely linear and padded with a lot of cutscenes and story, which many people had difficulty understanding because the game basically throws you into a scenario in which every proper noun is some made-up word, with no explanation or context provided as to what any of it means, leaving you bewildered and unable to care about anything that's going on. On top of that, there was very little, if nothing, to be excited about in terms of gameplay. Honestly, a lot of the time it just felt like they might as well have called the game running between cutscenes. In Final Fantasy XV, a lot of the crucial story and character development was stripped out of the main game itself and to be found in Brotherhood, Kingsglaive, and various DLCs, all of which should have just been part of the main game. The end result being that, again, it was difficult to understand the significance of what was happening. And I'm not against expanding on a game with DLCs or movies. In fact, I love that sort of thing. But they should be a complement to an otherwise complete game, not used to fill out massive gaps in an incomplete game. In addition to the problems with its story, they provided us with an amazing open world which, on the face of it, I love it. I absolutely love it. But there was not much to do in it. As much as I wanted to explore it, there was not much reward in doing so. It really just felt void of side quests and things to do which could have enriched the overall story and lore in Final Fantasy XV. With FF7R, a remake of arguably one of the greatest and most iconic video games ever made, a game of which is the reason that many people discovered the Final Fantasy series in the first place, and is widely considered to be a masterpiece, as well as being one of the most anticipated remakes in video gaming history. And what did they do? They only gave us one small portion of the game after 4 years in development, no less, taking sections from the original that were perfectly paced and memorable and padding them out with needless, linear gameplay that was very similar to Final Fantasy XIII and often added nothing further to the story. Even worse, spoiler warning, if you haven't played Final Fantasy VIIR, you should probably stop watching now. They critically changed the game's story despite explicitly putting the word remake in the actual title of the game, and thus deceiving millions of beloved fans into purchasing something that many of them have been waiting most of their lives for, only to not deliver on it. Now, look, I know I'm being very critical of Square Enix, and it might seem like I'm a hater, but actually, I love the Final Fantasy series. I grew up playing these games, and I've pretty much been playing them my whole life. But it's these kinds of decisions and many other things that we could discuss which have really broken my trust in Square Enix. And I know I'm not the only one who feels this way. I know many people personally who have given up on Final Fantasy, and you can see that there are many people all over the internet who have lost faith in it. I want to love these games. Every single Final Fantasy game, I went into it excited to play it and wanting to love every minute of it. But the fact is that over the last 15 years, this series just hasn't been up to par. It's very clear that Square Enix needs to pay more attention to the constructive criticism and feedback that's been leveled at their games in recent years. And honestly, I'm a little concerned that they won't, given the way in which they've responded to criticism in the past, which has pretty much come across to me as,
"Am I so out of touch?" No, it's the children who are wrong.
And so, ultimately, all of this begs the question, why should I expect that anything is going to be any different with Final Fantasy XVI?